Hi, I'm Candace Felice. In this Community Life in Northeast Georgia featured podcast,
we're on location in Rabun County visiting the famous Foxfire Museum, and we're with Barry Stiles. He is the museum curator here. Barry, thanks for inviting us into this beautiful museum.
Well, glad to have you here. We're excited to share what we have with the rest of the state and everyone else.
Barry, give our listeners the history of Foxfire and how the museum came into being.
Well, Foxfire began really as an English class. Students were not wanting to learn the way they were being taught and were encouraged to go out in the community, and they came up with this concept of writing a magazine, and so they went out and interviewed people in the community. This is back in 1966 when that began. They interviewed a lot of the older people, and they had been born in the 1800s, and life here was very different for them. You know, they lived without electricity, without running water, without things that we have. Basically, they lived that if they needed something or wanted it, they made it themselves. And the students began recording those stories of those people and their experiences and created the Foxfire magazine. And the magazine just grew very quickly, and eventually, of course, they wrote the Foxfire book from excerpts of the magazines. But all the time that the students were talking to the people in the community, the people just were grateful for the students for what they were doing, trying to preserve their culture that they knew was vanishing. And they began giving the students items, things, basically their belongings in some cases. And Eric Carpenter was interviewed many times by students, and she gave her table and chairs and her bed to students. And of course, this was just an English class, and they didn't really have a place that they could have those things, you know. So for a long time, they were just storing items they'd been given in any place that was dry in the community. Barns were just filling up around the area. And so they're really needing a place to exhibit these things, to store them, to preserve them, and also have them available to educate future generations about the past. And so after Foxfire Book 2 came out, the decision was made to take royalty money from Book 1 and Book 2 and buy the land that we're on right now. A lot of times they just refer to it as the land. There were no buildings up here. Of course, none of the items were here. And as part of their preservation, they went out in the regional community here and started finding log structures and getting permission and sometimes even purchasing them inexpensively and then disassembling them, bringing them up here on the mountain and reassembling them on site. And it was an amazing feat. And kids were doing the majority of the work. They had adult supervision, but they were doing a lot of the hands-on work of reconstruction of the pieces. And so they came up with this idea after bringing a grist mill up here to create a village. That's how really the village concept, and then that's grown into the museum that we have now. So it all started really with a magazine, interviewing people, them not only giving their stories, but then giving them things and really needing a place. And so it was just kind of an amazing course of events. And I think we have probably the best museum of Appalachia culture that there is. It's still growing to this day. When you go up to the museum, you'll have a better idea because we have close to 30 buildings now. And each building is a museum in itself. Now, people can come up here and do a self-guided tour, and we also do guided tours, and don't necessarily visit all of those buildings. They're used for different things. It's immense. We have 110 acres up here. We only use about probably 5 or 6 acres of it, and the rest is really wilderness, but it's still an amazing thing. So when you come up here, the nice thing about having that acreage is that you're isolated. You don't see the outside world very much when you're up here. So you really get a sense that you're going back in time, which is really nice. If the students had bought, down on the highway down there, you wouldn't get the same sense when you're up here. You'd be looking at Walmarts or something, and it would just be a different experience. And here you're looking at the mountains and surrounding historic buildings. So it's really like you're going back in time a bit. So it's really kind of special.
So when you speak of the buildings housing all of these artifacts, when you take your visitors up, you take them on a tour of each building, and do you tell the stories behind the pieces?
When we do a guided tour, we tell a lot of the stories behind the pieces of the artifact, but just because of time, we can't tell the story of every piece. It would just go on forever, but there are certain pieces that are more captivating than others and have really interesting stories, and each building has its own story as well. So it's really a combination of things when you go through a guided tour. Self-guided tour, you have a booklet you take with you, as well as signage on the buildings themselves that will talk about some of the things in the building as well as the buildings. Some of the artifacts that we have up there are in the Foxfire books, so there's a direct link to some of those things, and then others are just representative of what's typical of the history of the culture here. So there's a lot to see up there, though.
Do they have within all of these artifacts any specific person or persons that stand out in your mind that people, if they were to go through the history books, would say, oh my goodness, I didn't know this person came from Appalachia?
One of the interesting things about what the students were doing, they weren't really interviewing famous people. They were interviewing the average person of the time who were remarkable in their own right. And some of the people they interviewed, like Aunt Airy, for instance, became kind of famous because of being interviewed by Foxfire students. So it's a little bit of a strange twist. It was kind of interesting here in one of her interviews that she'd never gone to the movies. She just didn't have money. People live very differently than we do now. And the first movie she ever went to was one that she was in, and that was related to Foxfire. So she saw herself in the movie, which is, if you're going to see a movie and you're in it, that's a pretty good deal. So that was a pretty amazing thing. So that's a little bit of a different thing. They didn't go around interviewing someone like Dolly Parton, for instance, or those type of personalities. They were really doing local people who were hardworking. They had a lot of skills and talent and an amazing sense of humor. And they're just a wealth of knowledge. It's amazing to me how openly they shared with the students to give that much of themselves. I don't know if there are people today would do that. Although they're still doing interviews and people still have a story, those earlier ones were really special. They're very special. And they're what built the whole organization.
Well, the community itself up here in Rabun County, and I should just say those who are Appalachian or of Appalachian ancestry, there's a sense of place and a sense of family that translates in their making these different crafts to tell the story of their own lineage. Is there any story for you that stands out that maybe you can reckon back to someone in your family?
Oh, yeah. I was very fortunate when I was young. I got to spend time with my great uncle Mac, and he lived about 3 miles from here. And he was born in the 1800s and had lived without running water and electricity. And he was like my hero. He was my man, and I really looked up to him. And he really taught me a great appreciation of the old things. To him, he called them the old-timey ways, old-timey things. They didn't have the heritage thing. We call them heritage now, but he loved the old-timey things, and he was interviewed by Foxfire students and was in the magazine in the 70s and is in the books a lot. But he was really amazing, and he's very typical of what the mountain people were like. Hardworking. He wasn't that educated. He only had about a 6th grade education, but he was incredibly intelligent and would read every single day, just loved to read. He had learned how to learn. And kept learning his whole life. He just didn't have that much of a formal education, but you didn't back then. He was educated in around 1900, and it was different. He went into the Navy in World War I, so he was a veteran of the First World War and was very patriotic. His grandfather had been in the Civil War.
Goodness.
So it's just amazing. And that's the people that the early interviews were interviewing, people like that, and they were rugged. They were tough. You had to be tough to survive here because it was about surviving. You weren't becoming some rich guy. You were just trying to get by, making a life. And one of the things that really struck me about him and other people that were interviewed is that they loved living in the mountains. That's something they appreciated, and they're conscious of it. They didn't want to be anywhere else. They loved the mountains, and that was home to them. He was one of the few people that got to go outside of the mountains. Most people didn't. Maybe they went to the next county. It was very difficult traveling, but he got to go to Jamaica and all over, different areas because he was in the Navy, New York, for instance, and he wanted to be here and was very happy to be here. And it's interesting for people to be conscious of really the natural beauty, was something that they were aware of. In some ways, I'm kind of envious of that. They had a hard life, but it was simpler, but still was a valuable way of living. It's something we try to represent up here in the museum.
What was it that your uncle wanted you to know most about your heritage and to carry it on in your life?
Well, he was like the family historian, and so that was important to him. The history of the area, family history. But for him, he loved all of it. Not only the oral traditions of history, but he loved tools, he loved animals. His house that he lived in was built by his father, and that was something that he treasured, being able to live in that house, something that was constructed when he was just a child by hand, and that very typical of this area. If you wanted something, you had to make it, and that even means your house. And he was proud of that his father had built the house he lived in. And my exposure to that probably led me into my trade of carpentry, basically, or historical preservation carpentry. And then, of course, into more museum work. I guess that's kind of about that.
So is the house still in the family?
It is. My brother still lives in that house, and he's proud to live in it, too.
What does it mean to experience Foxfire?
Foxfire became well known. Teachers and other people wanted to know why it was working. Why were these students engaged when, they were having trouble engaging their own students? And so they kind of sat down and boiled out the factors of why it was working, and they came up with which is what's called the Foxfire core practices. And basically, there are instructions of how to engage your students. It's this kind of simplification of it. And teachers can come here through Piedmont College. It's a partnership we have with them, and they take a Foxfire teaching class. And so they learn those approaches to be able to apply that teaching method to their own classes. And it's not restricted to magazine class or an English class. You can apply it to a chemistry class or any other class. But basically, one of the most important factors is just giving the students choice. Students have a choice in what they do, what they learn, and the teachers are considered more of a facilitator in that choice as opposed to a dictatorship type situation. So it's a little bit different teaching approach, and something that a lot of people really value and get a lot out of it. And we get teachers from Canada, from all of the United States coming here and spending, I think, a 7-10 day class in the summertime. I think they offer about 3 or so classes each summer, and it's usually pretty full.
You mentioned Canada, as in other countries around the world know about Foxfire. In all parts of the world, what do they find most interesting about the Appalachian culture?
I think it's the people. When the kids were interviewing them, and they're still interviewing people, I think they really did a good job of really capturing the essence of the people. And when you read it, you think you know the person. And sometimes you do. I mean, they did such a good job that you really see them and understand some of their struggles they went through in their lives, their tragedies, but their joys also, and their wit and wisdom is captured a lot in those things. And people are captivated by that. They also do a lot of hands-on type things of making things, like making a chair, for instance. And a lot of people are interested in how people actually made things because they want to make something themselves. People in the history field like Foxfire, because the people that were interviewed are people that actually did it, people that lived it. So it's not an interpretation of what people did, it's what they actually did. And so it's very pure in that sense. The traditions stayed on here a long time. When they had vanished in other parts of the country, it was very isolated here. And so people lived the way they had lived for hundreds of years. They spoke a different language here. It was a dialect, but it was difficult for outsiders to come here and understand what people were even saying. And it's true. It's a little bit more an accent. It's just the way they talk, the way they pronunciated words, and their tense of words is something that goes back to Scotland and England from the early ancestors. And they came here in the 1700s, and the language didn't change that much. It had changed everywhere else, but here it didn't change. And so when people came in here, it was like they were going back in time almost. But it worked, and it's how people survived. And people were resistant to change. Now we're programmed to change. Something new means it's something better. And for people from the early 1900s, even into the 1950s, if something was new, it means it probably didn't work. And they didn't want to try it. If their parents did it a certain way, they want to do it that way because they know it works and they will survive. And it really came down to you have only so much energy you can put into something. You don't want to be experimenting with your own survival. You want to do it the way you know it's going to work and you know you're going to survive. You want to eat. I mean, there's a direct relationship between farming and eating. You were responsible for your own family and your own survival, and just something as simple as food. People had a very strong tradition here of planting by the signs, and can seem kind of archaic, but it's something that worked. And people relied on it, but they didn't have the internet. They couldn't look online and say, when do I plant my corn, for instance. They relied on the signs, which are largely based on astrological zodiac signs. And so that's how they knew how to plant, but that's how their parents had done it. And if they didn't do it by the signs, it wasn't going to work as good. So they wanted to do what worked, and that in itself helped preserve the culture. Outside influences, the mountains were a barrier, so coming in here was difficult. There's been a lot of changes in the past 40 years here, but when the Foxfire students were first going out interviewing those older people, there hadn't been the changes like there had been now. So they were able to capture that earlier culture, that's pretty much vanished by now. And it's really fortunate. A lot of people, because they were older, they died within a couple years of being interviewed. Very common. So if those kids hadn't come along when they had, all of that knowledge just would have been lost. It's a gift that I think the Foxfire students have given the country, myself, that they've captured these people before they vanished. We're very lucky to have that.
What were some of the staple crops that the early settlers planted that they knew year after year would yield the greatest harvest?
Here, everyone grew corn, and you needed corn. You preserved corn by drying it, and you could eat it year-round. That was really your primary crop right here, was corn. It was hard to grow corn. You had to cultivate the land. You had animals, if you're lucky, so you could use a mule to plow with and planted it by hand. And you had to hoe it by hand, and you had to harvest it by hand, and then you had to shuck it by hand. So it's a very labor-intensive crop to grow, but it's something that worked. The Cherokee Indians lived here. They grew corn. It's something that's been growing here for thousands of years. When the settlers came in, they brought their own corn. It was largely a white field corn, and then that was seeds that they just passed down through families. There's still families here that have the old seeds, that they raised. And green beans are another staple. They're also dried. People dried their green beans and then would soak them in water and cook them. You'd string them up with a needle and thread and just hang them up and let them dry. And then you'd just soak them in water. So you'd have a whole bunch of those strings strung up through your house, for food. And then your corn you'd keep out in a corn crib. And you'd have your corn ground, usually in the cornmeal, so you'd make bread out of it. And then the green beans you'd just cook and eat them like they were fresh beans once they're cooked. Those were your primary vegetables. Squash and pumpkins were also grown here, and cabbage.
With the green beans, did they salt them before they dried them out? Or
No, they're just strung up, like dehydration. And you'd have hundreds of them. Now, meat, they would salt, to preserve it. People raised a lot of pork here. That was one of your primary meat sources for, I don't want to say cultivated, but livestock. You raised pork. And in the old days, your animals were allowed to roam out in the woods, so they didn't fence them in, and pigs could just live wild out in the woods. You didn't have to feed them. They'd eat acorns and chestnuts and roots and things, and then you would bring in some in the fall and butcher them for meat, and then you'd salt it, and that salt would preserve the meat.
how did they know which hogs were theirs?
That's a good question. You're a thinker. How would they know? I ask people that on the tour. I say, how would you know that is your... Well, they had a simple system. They notched their ears, and that's all they did. And each family had an ear notch, a mark in the ear that was their own, and that was on file at the courthouse as proof of ownership. So it's a well-thought-out system, but it got complicated. That's one of the things my Uncle Mac was talking about, was those ear notches. And if you sold one and they had a different ear notch, then you got to somehow modify a pre-existing ear notch, and it could get kind of messy. So, but usually it didn't grow them for very long, And a lot of people had their hogs trained, and they just caught them.
When did chickens come up this way?
As far as I know, people have had chickens here, but they weren't grown in huge abundance. You'd have a few. You'd feed them corn, usually, and you'd collect eggs from them. And that was an important thing for women here. They could sell some eggs and get a little money, and they could sell butter and get a little money, and they called it their butter and egg money. And so there really was not very much money here. People lived without money. They traded stuff. But your butter and egg is something that you could get a little money for, and then you could buy something like sugar, or a little bit of fabric, something like that. So as far as I know, people had chickens. Usually they were like banties, we'd call them, banty hens, and they'd raise them. You'd eat chicken as well as pork. A lot of people would only eat meat, really, on Sunday. They just didn't eat as much meat as we do now, for the most part, but eat a lot of vegetables. It was a healthy diet.
For those who used corn to make money by making their own moonshine, when did that come about up here in the mountains?
As far as making moonshine, the first settlers were making moonshine. They brought it with them from Scotland and Ireland. That tradition of making whiskey is something that goes back to England, but typically you were making it for yourself and your family. You weren't making money on it. So the money part of it's the part I'm really not totally sure when that began, but I'd say certainly by 1900 or so, there was people exporting moonshine to make money. And of course, the more money that got involved, the worse the quality of it got. And it was those that were doing it for themselves that really had the highest standards and the highest quality. I got a little still sitting over there. That thing on that cabinet, there's a little moonshine still that was made by Buck Carver. He made moonshine for a living for a while, and then he got caught a few times and went to jail. So it always wasn't a happy story. But when he was making those little ones like that, that was legal. So he had legalized his operation and made those little miniature stills there, and people would make brandy in them. That was one that was given to us not too long ago. And it's a complicated process. It's not easy to do it. And those old types of still are a lot of work. It's a lot of work to make one, and then just to make the corn mash and the process. And you're talking about hours and hours of hard work just to get a little bit of moonshine from them. So it really wasn't that profitable. You had to be making 1,000 gallons to make money at it. And that's when the quality started going down, because then you're trying to pump it out and doing some shortcuts that most people wouldn't want to do. And then, of course, you've got to then get it to a buyer. And that started a whole industry in itself of people running liquor, which, led to NASCAR that we know now. But
We're back at the Foxfire Museum visiting with Barry Stiles. He is the curator here at Foxfire, and we're now taking a tour of the facilities that are here. And standing outside the Foxfire Archive building, you can listen to Ari Carpenter, who was born in 1885. There's no other person interviewed that was more beloved than Aunt Ari.
So, in other words, you think that, you'd a lot rather live today than you would back?
Oh, yes, it's a whole lot easier. Whole lot easier. You get out and work. I'll hold corn many a day for a quarter. Many a day. See, my brother stayed at home. My oldest brother brought up cattle, brought up a lot of cattle and brought in there. Well, we had to make a living for them, and he worked on a job. Well, we fed them cattle and tended to them. I tended to them cattle, and then he ran land from Mr. Dillard, George Dillard. You may have heard tell of George Dillard. He lived up there in Georgia. Well, now, used to work, Papa's worked for him many a day. And we have too. And we used to pick huckleberries, me and my brother did, and take to Mr. Dillard and swap 2 gallons of huckleberries for 1 gallon of syrup. We had to do something to make a living. Mommy wasn't able to help Papa do nothing, and Papa just had so much to do and had 4 boys. Of course, my baby brother died when he was 4 years old, and the rest of us still live, except Lindsay. Lindsay died here a while back. Lindsay Cave died not about 2-3 years ago. My oldest brother's dead, and my baby brother's dead. I'm between them. Down above, I was the oldest child.
Well, you made it all right, though, back, didn't you? You had your food. And
yeah, we made it all right. We always had plenty to eat. That's one thing we've always had, plenty of what we had. You don't know what I mean. We didn't have no great stuff that cost a lot. We never did buy that. We just didn't have enough to pay for it, and was always tried to pay as we went. If you get to going in debt, the next thing you know, you can't pay it to save your life. Right. I'm scared to death of debts. I hope for this road now. It worries me to death sometimes. If I go to bed and get studying about it, but I'm not to blame. He's the one to blame about that. He didn't come and bring the bill, and I don't know, and he don't come up here at all. I don't know why it's the reason, but he don't. I've been there twice and didn't get to see him. Ruth went 2 or 3 times. Nelson went 2 or 3 times. No, I think I'd way rather live than I was then. You can have a little money now. It used to be I didn't have one to mail a letter with. And you know how much candy I bought in my life before I was married? Now, I was 38 years old on Saturday, and I married a Sunday. I was 38 years old before I married. And I bought 1 nickel worth of candy in my life. I just didn't have nothing to buy with. Mommy was sick, and we had to hire so much help done. Some girl, Poppy hired hard a girl says, Mommy, ever till I got big enough to do the work. And you know how much he'd have to pay? 75 cents a week. He's hired a man a week. He hired Mel Carpenter. She was glad to lend Mel Battle. Mamie Prusher, that was his folks. And Mel Battle was Mommy's folks. He hired them for 75 cents a week a many times. They come work all week for 75 cents. Yes, sir. And Ada Henson, she is Gladys married Henson. I remember all she just had. This is where, and picked blackberries and strawberries and always had something to eat. We've always had something to eat. Pickled beans and everything. We pickled beans in a 20-barrel barrel. Yes, but I don't do that no more. I ain't got married this year. First year I missed them a long time. Gone home eating the beans up, and I never had nary one to pickle. I always had plenty of leather britches. We've always raised plenty of stuff to eat. Raised high 75 bushel. Our stayed over in that field over there. We've got a big field over there. It's good land. Oh, he'll go to bed now, I guess.
The next interview you will hear was done in 1967, and it was of Sheriff Luther Rickman. He was born in 1889. This is what Sheriff Rickman described the Clayton bank robbery with a little coaching from his wife.
On August the 26th, 1936, I was getting a haircut in Myers barbershop. Heard a gunfire. When I heard the gunfire, it was in a southerly direction. I ran out the door, and as I hit the sidewalk, Sanford Dixon hollered, said, Sheriff Rickman, run to the bank. The bank's being robbed. They have just gone out in a black car. When that happened, I ran into the front of the bank, and Mr. T.A. Duckett was coming in at the back of the bank. And Miss Drew Willa Blakely was the only person in the bank when the robbers came in. When they called for the money, she screamed and ran out at the back of the bank and into the back of Dover and Green's drugstore and screamed to Dr. Dover that this bank was being robbed. Dr. Dover walked out at the front door, and as he hit the sidewalk, one of the robbers with a small machine gun said, "Big boy, get back in there," and shot down near his feet. Dr. Dover said he felt of himself to see if he had shot. Fred Derrick ran into the bank. Dave's hardware. Oh, I'm telling you what happened. Ran into the bank, said to me, Sheriff Rickman, we'll get some guns and ammunition, and ran to Reeves and began to jerk down guns and ammunition. And from that, I deputized 2 men and jumped in a little old Ford and started south in the direction the robbers had went, and a man hollered at me and said, Sheriff Rickman, nails in the road. And I took the wrong side of the road and dodged the nails, and when I did, the nails lasted from Clayton to Tiger, Georgia, a little below Tiger. I went from there to Cornelia, Georgia. And when I got in Cornelia, I got a message that this car had turned on the Eastman Road. I came back and traced that car from the Eastman Road across to the War Woman Road, went east to Pine Mountain, turned north and went to Highlands, and from there over into Transylvania, North Carolina, into a logging camp where these robbers had a hideout. And from there, the robbers spent the night. And next night, had a wreck in Old Fort, North Carolina, and wrecked their car and held a man up from Charlotte, North Carolina, and took his car and ran his car a few miles, and the car broke down, and I found it on an old mountain road.
We're at the archive building, and to me this is the most important building we have in the museum. It's where we store all of our interviews. We have audio, and we have video, and we have transcripts of those, as well as over 100,000 black and white negatives that students have taken, plus all their articles. All of that stored in this building right here. So it's just a treasure trove of things. And we were looking at this tape recorder right here. I was making fun of yours. There's a little tiny one. The early days, they used reel-to-reel tape recorders. And that one weighs about 50 pounds. And you have to have electricity. And that was challenging for some of the interviews. A lot of people didn't have electricity. One guy was telling me he was interviewing somebody, and they didn't use electricity, but they had an outlet way up in their rafters, and they pulled it down so they could plug the recorder into it so he could record the interview. And the people had never seen a tape recorder before. So he recorded the man for a minute and then played it back to him so he could hear it. And he said, "Yeah, sure enough, that's what I said." Where do you get one of those voice catchers? I want to get me one. Well, but then they switched to cassettes when they came out. They didn't come out to the early 70s, and then it made it a lot easier because they could run on batteries, and you could get a lot of things done out in the field.
This is Georgia Red Clay.
Yeah, it is.
Oh my goodness.
I'll have to turn on some lights in here.
Okay.
So this building has central heat and air in it, just in a dehumidifier for maintaining the right temperature and humidity for our collections. When you come in here, it's files, valuable files. These are all transcripts. So when the students would go out and interview somebody, they would record them, like you're doing right there. Then they do a word-for-word transcript, and then it goes in that file over there. And then from the transcripts, they would write articles for the magazine. They'd take photographs, and these black notebooks are all negatives in there. In the old days, they used a black and white film, and they had to learn how to process it. So there's a little dark room in here that they would actually come here and develop the film, and then print it, and do an actual photographic print, and then do a cut and paste layout using a typewriter and stuff to do the magazine. So that technology's changed a lot, but still it's amazing what they did. Even more amazing when you think about the labor involved in it.
Very labor intensive.
Those are cassette tapes in those bins up there. And the earliest tapes are on reel-to-reel. We have a whole bunch of reel-to-reel in this other room.
We're in the actual building where the students would do all of their interviews as far as making them into print.
Well, they do some of that in the classroom and then some here. It kind of was a combination of things depending on the time of year and everything.
I'm looking at this photograph of this woman weaving on a loom. Is this a blanket that she's making?
Maybe a coverlet.
Okay.
hard to just looking right back behind her there.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a little smaller than a blanket. Students would learn, from doing an article like that, and she was weaving. And we have a weaver just down from us that we'll visit, hopefully, and she does weaving in her shop.
I'm shaking this staircase, and it's not going anywhere. You can't do that with today.
Well, good. And if it did, we'd edit it out. That's not part of this interview.
The Julia B. Fleet Library. Now, was she one of the interviewees?
No, she was a supporter.
Okay.
And a donor. And they have a little library back in here, primarily for research, for doing articles and things. So it's not really Foxfire material, but resource material.
Okay.
Now this is part of the Moore House, and this is what we call our folk art gallery. So it's a collection of folk art, and you can see there's furniture in here and toys and various things. A lot of the things in here are in some of the Foxfire books, so if people are familiar with the books, will recognize a lot of these items. That's really awesome little
the
wagon.
stagecoach.
Yeah, the stagecoach. Handmade. Even the mules are handmade out of wood right there.
Oh my goodness.
Just amazing amount of detail in there.
Now, some parent made that for their child for Christmas, I'm sure.
Well, it was a man that made this. And it's in one of our articles. But it's a nice little thing.
And the furniture, they even made little rocking chairs
Yeah.
for the babies.
Kenny Runyon made most of this furniture in here. That's his picture right over there on the left.
Okay.
He liked making this furniture out of mountain laurel, which is now it's really popular, but he was making it 40, 50 years ago, and it wasn't as popular back then, but he made a little income from making it, and that helped him.
Is mountain laurel a sturdy wood?
It's very strong, very, very strong. It grows really slow. Has a nice patina to it.
There's even a crutch over against the wall.
Yeah. There's all kinds of things in here. This is one of those rooms, every time I come in here, I see something different I haven't seen before.
This is the most beautiful dollhouse I have ever seen. I don't know of houses made today that are this well crafted.
Yeah, it's got a little rope bed in there. I don't know if you've seen that. The mattress and stuff.
A potbelly stove, a wrought iron bed. This house is fully furnished. It's gorgeous.
These pieces here are all by C.P. Lagone.
Okay.
He was a fairly famous folk artist, and this piece was on display for a while at Smithsonian as a piece of American folk art. So it's pretty important. He was a roofer his whole life and did these little sculptures out of logs and things. They're kind of fun.
Oh, this is a beautiful piece.
Yeah, it's very old.
Guess we classify it as some type of hutch.
Yeah, sideboard or something like that. It's a little swollen up from the humidity.
Yeah. Oh, and they even made grandfather clocks.
That's a masterpiece, I think, right there. Kenny Runyon did the chairs, made that clock housing right there out of laurel.
You could spend more than a day out here just to absorb all of it. I see steel bars on the window. Was this a jailhouse?
In the early days of Foxfire,
Oh, okay.
not the early history here, so they had these bars to keep people from stealing their machinery, but I don't think anyone would have stolen it. They felt better if it was barred. I see that airplane hanging there.
Yeah.
You'll never guess what that's made out of right there. This one hanging right here.
What?
Cornstalk. Everyone grew corn, so corn was something you had a lot of. People would make toys out of corn stalks. People would make dolls out of the corn shucks, and we have all these little dolls over here. That's really creative to take something that, most people just throw out and turn it into really a work of art.
And to paint it, because the dresses are painted different colors.
Yeah, they're dyed, and some people would even put hair. You can see a little hair from the corn silks and little faces on them.
Very ingenuitive.
Yeah.
Age of technology, people take for granted and think that children grow up to be a lot smarter. But I think the intelligence was in abundance because you had to be so imaginative to create these type of things.
People were very creative. They had time and creativity and skill. A lot of skill. And then this is a whirly gig, which is kind of fun.
Oh, God. A whirligig?
So the wind would make that turn, and then all these pieces would do something. Have these two guys sawing a log, and one man splitting, and then the supervisor back there smoking his pipe.
Sitting on the rocking chair.
Rocking back first, watching.
And it's called a whirligig.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of mechanics involved in that thing.
Wow.
This is a fun little toy we let kids play with right here. You know what it does?
It dances.
It dances, yeah, you do. So we dance on the board.
Oh, okay.
So you'd sit on one end of it, and you want it to spring like that.
Mm-hmm.
Add some music, you can get them going too. It's called a lumberjack. This is a newer one, and we have some very old ones over there. That one sitting up on that mantle is a really antique one.
Well, since Foxfire's been around for so long, families just know in this area to donate their heirlooms to the museum.
Yeah, people donate stuff to us pretty regular. They want it preserved for the future. You know, there may not be anyone in their family that really appreciates it or want it, but they want future generations to be able to see it and know that it's taken care of. And that's part of what we do here is preserving the culture, and that means physical things as well. And we're a good place for it, I think.
We're in the second museum.
We call this one the museum cabin, and it's where we have most of our woodworking tools. And this churn right here is made by Alex Stewart, who was interviewed by Foxfire students. Totally made out of wood by hand and is watertight. I mean, that takes a lot of skill to make something out of wood like that. That's watertight. Even these hoop rings right here are made out of wood that hold it together. People used wood a lot in the old days. I like to call it the wood age because everything's wood, you know, because metal was very expensive, wood was abundant, and you just used it for everything.
Did he explain to the students in the interview how he did this?
Yes, he sure did. They have an excellent article on making that churn right there. Some of these tools are actually his that are on the wall here. His family donated it to Foxfire, and it's a nice place for him. He was just incredibly skilled. And you can see that the buckets and churns, they're different sizes at the top and bottom, so all your pieces that make it are tapered and on an angle because it's going in a circle.
And they're so smooth.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Do you think that it could be replicated today?
Well, it could be done. It'd be hard.
Because this is all hand done.
Right. Most people wouldn't want to do it because it takes, 100 hours to do something like that. Now we just want something done fast. These were tools. People used them, so they were an important part of your life. You had to make butter, so the churn was something you used to make butter with, and bucket, of course, for water. So they were more necessities. But nowadays, most people aren't making butter anymore. You just go to the store and buy it.
Do you know how long it took to make butter?
Here, before they churned butter, they would collect cream and milk and then let it clabber. And it's basically milk that's sourdine getting thick. And that can take a few days. And then they would churn it. And it could take, depending on the temperature, 30 minutes to churn butter. Just up and down, up and down. So some people would have little chants, like songs that they would sing to make it go by faster. And so there's a whole collection of churning chants for churning butter. And I've tasted butter that's been churned. I used to eat it as a child, and modern butter just doesn't come close to how rich and delicious that old hand-churned butter is. I mean, it is very, very rich and good.
When you had the Foxfire days, do the exhibitors actually churn the butter here? And
we have had people churn butter. Had a lady make some peach cobbler and put some churned butter on some peach cobbler. But this basket I want to tell you about, because this is really neat right here. It's for catching fish.
The Cherokee used them.
Yeah, that's right. And this would be placed in a river, and a rock dam would be formed, and then the fish would go in there, and there's little fingers in there that the fish can't get out once it gets in there, and you could get fresh fish. You could herd the fish down the river. There are a lot of fish up here.
What kind?
There's horsehead. I've heard of salmon coming up here. Fish from the Gulf of Mexico would come up here. Fish from the Atlantic would come up here on the other side of us. But then when they built the dams for the power plants and things, it disrupted that migration of fish. So there used to be all kinds of fish that migrated up here to spawn. Then they'd go back to the ocean. And here we are way up in the mountains. You just wouldn't think that fish would be coming that far, but they did. They come up the Mississippi River and then eventually to the Little Tennessee River, which is right down there, and then lay their eggs and then go back or die. This saw, called the felloe saw, is used for making part of the wagon wheel. And the outer curved portion of the wheel is called the felloe. And that's all that saw was used for right there, is cutting that part, kind of like a jigsaw by hand. You're going up and down with it, sawing a curved piece of wood out. The wheel is made up of
arcs.
Arcs, right, and then the spokes go into the arcs. And it's not one piece of wood, it's several pieces of wood, maybe 8 pieces of wood that are cut, kind of like a little curved piece.
Oh, okay.
And you're cutting those curved pieces out of a square piece.
Okay.
With that saw. And you got to clamp it in a vise to hold it and then use that saw to cut it.
Barry, you said that this building that we're looking at right now is the building where the classes go on?
Yeah, it's called the Longhouse, and it's where they do the actual Foxfire teaching class that Piedmont College does over the summertime. Usually it's Hilton Hill teaches a class several weeks out of the summertime, and some students will stay in this building. It has 3 or 4 bedrooms in it, and the main classroom is in this building here.
Now, you were saying that the majority of the buildings here are authentic buildings from the period. So how would you date the buildings? Were they the 1800s or early 1900s?
Most of our buildings are from the 1800s. Some are from the later 1800s, and the grist mill, which we just drove by, is actually one of the most recent buildings. It was built in the 1930s.
What type of wood and stone did they use here?
Well, the school building is kind of interesting because it actually is a historic building. Just the actual classroom is a newer addition to the building, but it's what's called a dog trot building, and it has a central hallway down it. And mostly this building is made out of oak. Okay. That is hand-hewn. The logs are squared up with an axe, and the corners are a half dovetail notch. That's a special kind of joint that kind of locks it together without using nails. And the rocks that most people would use would just be field stones, that they'd find out in the surrounding area. And then between the logs, I don't know if you can see it too good, but there's a space between the logs, and then they fill that space with stuff. And traditionally, it's just Georgia red clay. That's called the daubing or chinking that helps keep the building warm. It keeps the wind out. This building, they use mortar in it, but traditionally it would be just clay, something you had around you. So you're using trees that were off the land and you're using mud and rocks from the land. Just use what you had. You couldn't go buy it, so you're just using what was there.
Okay, Barry, now we're at the guest house?
Yeah, this is a house where a lot of the students that come here and take the class will stay. I believe it has 8 bedrooms in it. It's a large house. It's made out of some old historic pieces that have kind of been recycled into this building, and then it had a second story added on to it. It's really nice inside. It has chestnut siding inside the building, which is really nice. It's a comfortable place to stay. When we do our Living History Day, we have a lot of our demonstrators will stay up here in this building, as well as the longhouse down there. So it gets a lot of use.
What was it before?
It was a residence. Bob and Margie Bennett lived here, and they were on the Foxfire staff in the early years, and it's where they lived in the early 1970s. Now, we have some buildings here that are 100% authentic historic structures. Then we have a couple that are built out of recycled logs from buildings that really weren't in good enough condition to rebuild. They kind of modified the structure a bit, which was a good use of the materials and enhanced the facility by doing what they did too.
Barry, although this is a dreary, rainy afternoon when we're touring the place and we're having to take the tour by car, people can come and see the facility by foot most days.
Yeah, we encourage people to walk. It's only about a quarter-mile total walk, so it's not very long. And it's a little bit different experience on foot than by car, so it's nice to be out in the woods and come upon a historic building like we're looking at there. It's a peaceful experience up here. That's kind of interesting. The students are wanting to do the village thing, and create a village. And, of course, you have to have a chapel or a church in the village. And usually every valley here in this area would have its own little church, and they still do. There wasn't anyone really wanting to give a church away. Oh. And you can understand, people are using them. So they built this church based on a church up in Waynesville, North Carolina. Uh-huh. And they used recycled logs from an old barn to create it. And it's very accurate. I've seen pictures of the church they copied up there, and it's really neat. So it's one that's really a reconstruction as opposed to actual historic building.
It really is beautiful. So this would be another hybrid, if you will, where you brought the authentic materials up here and just constructed it for different purposes.
Right, yeah, it was slightly repurposed. And that was just by necessity. If they had been given a church, they would have built a church here. Still, it's an important part to have the church as part of the museum. There's just a whole bunch of things. People went to church and singing, I know you were talking about music, and there's a whole bunch of special kind of singing that people did at church, and it's different than what we do now.
They use shape notes.
That's right, shape notes, and they didn't have musical instruments in church. They just used their voice, and shape note singing was huge in the mountains here. Most people couldn't read music, and shape note singing is actually very complicated. It sounds simple, but you had to be taught shape note singing. There were, 7 notes in the scale, and each note has a shape. But then you also had to be able to read the time and, eighth note versus a whole note and all that. So it's still, you have to have some rudiments of music theory behind you and harmonies. But it's a beautiful sound. Students went out and recorded a lot of people singing sheep note singing back in the 80s. And we have some of those recordings in our archive. And I listened to some of them, and it's just amazing the sound of it. When you have a church filled with people singing harmonies, and the sheep note singing sounds much different than modern music that we have today. It's almost medieval sound. It's really fascinating to hear it. And some of them, when they sing it, they'll sing the note first. They sing the scale fa, sol, la, mi, and they'll sing fa, and you have people singing different words at the same time, so it's a little weird to listen to. And then they'll sing the actual verse after that. I find it fascinating to listen to it. So at some point, my hope is actually to have an audio feature that people could listen to that here, and hopefully I'll do that this year.
And for families that want to come out and make a day of it, you do have a picnic area here.
We sure do. This time of year is usually pretty nice. Today's not so nice. But yeah, people love to come picnic, and we get school groups come up here, and the whole class can come up here and have a picnic lunch and have a tour. So we get a lot of schools come up here and a lot of families. So you can spend a day here or an hour, or a few hours, just whatever suits you.
Now we're in the final part of our tour.
This is our Savannah house, and it's the oldest building we have up here, built around 1820. And when it was originally built, they didn't use any metal nails in the construction of it, not a single metal nail. And between the logs is just red clay and rocks. Most of the logs are made out of poplar in this building, and they've all been hewn by hand. People couldn't get glass here in the early 1800s, and this house has no glass windows in it and never has. When the students rebuilt this house, they put wooden hinges back on it because originally it had wooden hinges, and these are made out of dogwood. They've been here for about 40 years and work just as good as the day they were built. And you wouldn't think that wood would last that long, but it works fine. It's actually kind of a big house for its time. It's one room with one fireplace.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
So that's where you cooked, where you got heat, and where you got some light. Now guess what these are, Ken?
Those are leather britches.
There you go. Leather britches beans. There you go. We live and breathe.
Could you eat them today?
Well, you could. Those have been hanging there for about 3 years. If they're 1 year old, they'd be good. You soak them in water, eat them.
Yeah.
They'd be fine. This table and chairs right here are items that belong to Aunt Airy.
Oh.
And you can see how that chair is kind of low. She was not very tall. She actually stood at this table. This was like a counter for her.
She was tiny.
Yeah. And she would make her, bread and things on that. And this bed over here was one of her beds.
Wow.
It's a fancy bed for its time because it's been turned on a lathe.
Uh-huh.
Most people didn't have something this fancy. That's really a nice bed, and it's got a rope in it. So it's called a rope bed. Ropes like your springs.
Is this her original mattress?
I don't think so. I don't think that's the original mattress.
That doesn't look very comfortable. You've got straw.
Yeah, this one has straw. This one has feathers, which is a little softer. But you just put something soft in there, and you got to change it, periodically. There's a loft in this building. There would have been a ladder over there, and we don't have that just for safety, but kids would sleep in the loft when they got old enough to climb it.
Okay.
And there's no heat up there. There's no fireplace, nothing up there. So to stay warm, you'd have to have quilts. You sleep on a mattress with quilts piled on you. And you could wake up, and there could be snow on your covers, because the snow could blow underneath the shingles of your roof. It was a lot like being outside. And they raised 10 children in this house, which is hard to imagine.
In thinking of it in a 2012 mindset, you think people stay in their houses. Back then, they were out in the field. They were outside all day long, and so they only came in to eat and sleep.
That's right. Kids were working.
Right.
They weren't in here playing Nintendo.
Correct.
They were getting firewood and bringing in water, and they had chores to do. So, yeah, it really wasn't the way we live now. So it's a little misleading. But still, 10 people sleeping under one roof, it's a little tight. But they'd be upstairs if they got old enough.
Well, if they were like Miss Airy, they were tiny people.
Yeah, that's true. They was, but some of the men are big.
Even today, it's a beautiful, beautiful home.
If you look around in here, there's no closet in here. You didn't have that much clothing. You might have a chest. And that was actually Aunt Airy's chest right there. That was donated to us about a year ago as a blanket chest. So your extra blankets in the summertime that you weren't using, you'd store in there. But you really didn't have that much extra clothes.
Again, it was a different time when everything was for function and not for foolishness, I should say.
People use doors for air conditioning.
Yeah.
Doors and a hatch. There's that little thing there we call a hatch. It's like a window.
Yeah.
So it has a board on it that flips up and down. People paid attention to not only where they placed doors and windows, but how they oriented their home with the sun. In the wintertime, you want that southern light and warmth coming in your front door usually. So they're facing south-southwest. The north side up here is brutally cold, and it may freeze and, not thaw out till March easily because the angle of the sun is so low. Once it freezes and stays in the shade, even if it's 50 degrees, it won't melt till sun gets on it. So you had to be careful about that. And I've noticed now that people are going back to orientating their homes that way because it's more energy efficient.
Okay.
And it improves your life quality. For a while, people just thought they knew what was best and did whatever they wanted to, and really the old way was better. People knew what they were doing, it's for a reason.
Well, Barry, thank you so much for taking us on this tour today of this beautiful museum, and each one of them is absolutely chock full of history, and it's a reminder to us of not only history but of keeping the legacy of the families that lived here alive.
Well, thank you for coming. It's been a pleasure. Been a real pleasure.
Today we've been on location at the Foxfire Museum in Mountain City, Georgia. To find out more information on Foxfire, you can visit their website at foxfire.org.
We hope you've enjoyed this Community Life in Northeast Georgia featured podcast brought to you by WPPR Demarest, a Georgia Public and NPR affiliate radio station from the Piedmont College Demarest campus in the Swanson Center complex on 88.3 FM. To contact us, email wppr@piedmont.edu. And if you'd like to know more about local life and events in Northeast Georgia, join in on the conversation at Facebook at WPPR Demarest. I'm Candace Felice.
Come on with me, a rolling meadow walk for two, a marionette bouquet for you. Do